I'll take that as a yes. Okay, everybody, welcome. We're going to talk about rapid prototyping for Salesforce automation today. Really excited to be here. And even before I start, I just want to give a quick thanks and a quick shout out to Vicky and to Mark for organizing this conference. This conference is fantastic, and I'm super excited to be here. So we are going to talk about rapid prototyping for Salesforce automation today. And I am going to give you a quick overview of myself. I am 12x certified Salesforce architect. I have run an independent consulting business in the Salesforce space for 10 years. I have 18 years of experience building CRM systems. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. Definitely connect with me there. This is a relatively short session, about 25 minutes. So if you have questions or want to interact further, definitely hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn. So very quickly, we're going to talk about a quick overview of what prototyping is all about. We're going to talk about some benefits. We're going to talk about some example tools. I'm going to give you a specific business use case, and we'll walk through how some of the tools could work. I'll give you a few additional considerations, some resources, and then I want to save about 5 minutes at the end for questions. If you have questions at any point throughout, put them in the chat, and Akash will stop me, and we will hit those questions in real time. Since this is a relatively short session, I want to get to questions as they come up, so don't hesitate to put them in the chat. Okay, so we're talking about automation in this conference, and when we talk about automation or any project, any IT, any Salesforce project, any IT project in general, one of the big risks that is sometimes not talked about is the risk of in automation missing the mark in terms of the business requirements or the business logic that we're trying to implement. There's a statistic that sort of gets thrown around in the IT consulting space that something like 70% of all IT projects fail. And the number one reason why they fail is because of business requirements that don't capture what the stakeholders actually need. So when we're talking about Salesforce automations, flows, custom Apex, Dolores, whatever we're talking about, these are powerful tools because they actually take the business logic that they're implementing and they shield the users or the stakeholders from that business logic. It's what makes them powerful. And at the same time, it can make it difficult for stakeholders to actually see what's going on behind the scenes and to confirm or disconfirm that the automation logic meets their requirements. So a lot of times you'll see an automation project where issues aren't identified till the very end or even once the automation goes into production because everything looks good until the users start actually really using it quite a bit and they see where the logic doesn't necessarily meet their requirements. I call it here, even the flow builder can obscure automation logic. The flow builder is a fantastic tool, and the canvas can be actually used to illustrate some sense of the business logic, but even that obscures a lot of the details, a lot of the relevant details. So even something as visual as the flow builder can obscure some of that logic. Our goal as folks who are building automation is to bring the requirements and bring that business logic to the forefront as soon as possible so stakeholders can see it clearly and adjust it as necessary. And this is where prototyping is so powerful. So prototyping is, we like to call a quick and dirty artifact that enable stakeholders to interact with a concept or a feature and provide feedback quickly. It can be something as simple and as low fidelity as just a little sketch on the back of a napkin, whether that's a little flow diagram, a little flow chart, or some logic built out on the back of a diagram. I'm going to talk about some other methods as well, but the idea here is it's cheap, it's quick, and you get it out to the stakeholders so they can view things as quickly as possible. Okay, and a prototype, to be clear, prototype should be as clear about what the solution won't deliver, what the limitations and the drawbacks of the potential solution could be as they are about what they will deliver. A prototype is not for selling a solution. I'm going to repeat that again. A prototype, the purpose of a prototype is not to sell a solution. It's to confirm or disconfirm that a solution addresses the user's needs. And one of the ways that a prototype can be so powerful is it can illustrate scenarios that the stakeholders haven't considered. And I think folks that are building automations probably see this a lot, where you put a solution in front of stakeholders and they say, oh, this is great. And then they realize, oh, there's this scenario or there's this situation that we hadn't thought through, that we hadn't considered. And that can really change the complexion of the solution. So prototypes are great for taking those scenarios that they might not have considered, that stakeholders might not have considered, and put them in front of them sooner rather than later. Very quickly, I'll talk through the benefits of obviously avoiding rework or throwaway work. These quick and dirty prototypes, by their nature, are quicker and cheaper than building out the automation. So we avoid the sometimes costly process of building out the automation. It allows us to focus on the logical considerations and the requirements independently from the technical considerations. So if we're building out whatever, Apex, Flow, these are relatively complex tools. It allows us when we're focusing on requirements and logic, to just focus on that and not worry about, does the code work? I ran into this issue on Flow. How do I build this on Flow? We can just focus on the logical and the requirement stuff. It makes the logic transparent. It makes it easy to confirm or disconfirm. And number 5, it also gives your stakeholders potentially an artifact that they can share, with people across the organization, and it can help them to build consensus or build shared understanding of what we're trying to build. I'm going to talk through a few example tools and methods. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. It's a few examples. And one of the important things I'd say about prototyping is there's not one way to do it. There's not one perfect syntax to do it. So it's really about being creative, being flexible, thinking about the questions that you have, and figuring out a way to communicate those. So I'm going to give you a few examples, but none of these are to say there's one particular right way or wrong way to do it. So I talked about pen and paper as a really great way to prototype. And I think it's a LinkedIn post or a tweet that Pei and Andy from Florida Dreamin. Andy did a presentation on Flow, and he said pen and paper may be the best way to start. And I think pen and paper is a great way to kind of plan out the flow that you're doing. It's also a great way to communicate what you're doing with your stakeholders and get some feedback on what you're planning. So pen and paper, pseudo code or text, I'm going to talk through an example of that. Scenarios that you could even just put into a spreadsheet, I'll talk through that in more detail. A logical diagram like a Lucidchart or a Visio. Again, we're being super practical here, so there's not necessarily one sort of syntax like UPN or something else that you'd use. It's really just about building out some piece of the logic so people can see it. And there's a number of UI prototyping tools out there, Figma, Balsamic. I'm not going to talk through those today because our use case is more around sort of record trigger flows for this presentation, but know that UI prototyping is a big space, and there's a bunch of tools there. Akash, I'm going to pause for one quick second and see, are there any questions that folks have? All right. All right, so I will keep going. In terms of tools and methods, one thing that's important to consider is sometimes, particularly for something complex, it can be useful to use multiple prototyping tools for one piece of logic. And I'll talk through that in an example. But when we get into something complex, sometimes doing a few different things can help uncover some of the questions or help illustrate some of the concepts. So I'm going to go through an example. And the business example that we've got here is we have a company, and the company wants to place clients into a rewards program. And they want to do that based on closed deals, opportunities, and the account type. So if we think about rewards programs as being like a platinum level, a gold level, a silver level, or not in any level at all, um, this company wants to look at all the opportunities associated with account based on the amount, how many of them there are, etc., the type of account, whether it's an enterprise account, etc. Look through all that and place place an account into one of those buckets, whether it's platinum, gold, or silver. I'm going to go through how we could use pseudocode, scenarios, and a diagram to help illustrate and prototype that logic. So our first example is pseudocode. Folks are probably familiar with this. Generally, it's just writing out the logic in an if-then statement format. There's other ways to do it as well, but generally this is how you see it. And the benefit of pseudocode and writing out this way is generally it's a quick way to do it. People can generally sort of read through it and see it. If you look here in our example, remember I said we've got platinum, gold, silver, and none. So just to use our example, if an account has an amount of closed opportunities that's greater than million, or count of closed opportunities greater than 3, or it's an enterprise account with any closed opportunities, then we want to set it to platinum, and we want to put it in a platinum email list in Pardot. I'm not going to go through all the rest of them, but that's sort of the level of logic that we can kind of quickly capture in a pseudocode example. And this can be great. Oftentimes business stakeholders like really dig this format, and they can see it, and they can see what the logic is. One of the drawbacks of pseudocode is that sometimes it can get so complex, and it's necessarily focused on kind of what they call like the happy path, or what it does, and it can obscure negative cases, unhappy path scenarios, or edge cases. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but good format, but it can sometimes obscure stuff if it gets too complicated. Second example is scenarios, and this is basically what it sounds like. It's just writing out a number of different, very specific business scenarios and identifying what the outcome of the automation would be. This is similar, I should say, to test cases. Sometimes when people write out test cases, it's similar. But keep in mind, our purpose here is not documentation or test cases. It's to validate some ideas or some concepts. So this is by no means comprehensive. We're just taking some use cases, putting it in front of our stakeholders to have them give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on it. One of the great things about putting scenarios out there like this is it's really great for highlighting edge cases. Okay. So I had mentioned earlier in our example that we're trying to put companies into buckets of platinum, gold, silver rewards program. Well, our third, is that our second or our third? Our second example is we've got an account that has 5 closed opportunities. Wow, that's great. That shows like it's a high value account, except, oh wait, the opportunities amount is $1 each, right? So very low opportunity amount. And that's a great example you can put in front of a client and say, hey, are you sure you'd want this account that only has $5 of revenue associated with it put in the platinum bucket? It's just a really great way to kind of test some of those edge cases. So that's that format of scenarios. And then last is just a logical diagram. And again, this is going through, it's basically taking those if-then conditions and putting it in a visual format. I'm not going to go through this in detail. And I should also say, this is not necessarily any industry standard syntax I'm using here. If there's one that you're comfortable with, definitely feel free to use that. But the purpose here is to illustrate the logic. It's not to be comprehensive. It's not to use an industry standard necessarily. And I should also say, with a diagram like this, there may be one part of the automation that's particularly high risk, or particularly complex, or particularly you have a concern that the stakeholders haven't quite thought it through. You can just diagram a particular piece of the logic. You don't need to be comprehensive. And with diagrams, make sure to keep readability in mind. That's really important. And I have a link here actually to one of the well-architected videos where Tom Letty talks through readability in terms of diagrams. He's talking about it more in terms of documentation and architecture, not prototypes, but it's a really great video. It's 5 minutes if you want to check it out. And I should also say too, complex if-then logic sometimes can get unwieldy in a format like this. So your mileage may vary. Kind of use common sense in terms of what makes sense, and know that these are communication tools. So just want to make sure they're readable. Additional considerations very quickly. We want to make sure that we're servicing edge cases within reason, right? We're not trying to hit every single edge case, but think about high impact edge cases that, again, stakeholders might not have thought about. Think about negative test. Think about negative cases. And when I say negative cases, I mean scenarios where the automation doesn't run. Okay. A scenario where, if I go back to our example a couple slides before, a scenario where the automation doesn't trigger, and make sure that the stakeholders are aware of when this automation does trigger as much as they are about when this automation doesn't trigger, because sometimes that can be a gotcha for stakeholders. And then unhappy path. So scenarios that aren't all that common or aren't all that top of mind, again, within reason, but thinking through those if there's one that's potentially high impact. So the example I used here is if a closed won opportunity is reopened. Okay, not something that people think of a lot, but if there's a potential impact there, it's something you want to surface up. And then if you have open questions, you definitely want to put those right in front of folks so you can get answers to them.
Hi, Brian. There is a small request. Catherine actually has asked, can the link to the video be added to the chat?
Yeah.
You can please share it on the chat.
Yeah. Hold on 1 second. Here you go. Those videos are awesome, by the way. They have a whole bunch of videos that Susanna and Tom and others made in the Architect Evangelist team made. So definitely check them out. Okay, so additional considerations. A few last things before I wrap up on the prepared comments. Once again, I want to stress this: prototypes are not a substitute for documentation. The purpose of a prototype is not to be comprehensive. It's to get specific questions answered and to get feedback. So a lot of these things actually can be the starting point for documentation, but what you don't want to get into, the purpose of this is to be fast and to be nimble and to be quick. So if you're spending time putting together comprehensive documentation, it kind of defeats the purpose. So that's one point. Second point to call out: the result of a prototype might be that stakeholders decide they need an entirely different solution, or maybe they need no solution at all. Okay. And that's okay. That's actually one of the reasons for doing a prototype, right? To get that validation that you're going in the right direction. So imagine if you didn't do a prototype and you got through the whole thing, you built it all out, and they said, oh, wait, this isn't what we need. We need something else. A lot of time and frankly, goodwill wasted there. So a couple resources if you want to learn more. On Trailhead, there is a fantastic trail called Strategy Design Prototyping. They go through some great examples there as well. And for folks who are interested in going even further, Salesforce Strategy Designer certification is great. There's tons of methods in there, not just prototyping, but a bunch of sort of lean and design thinking methods that will help you in similar ways to prototyping. As folks probably know, I'm a big advocate and believer in the strategy design cert. So if you're interested, definitely check it out. And if you're interested in chatting about that cert, definitely hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter, and happy to chat with you about it. All right, that's it. And I said I'd leave 5 minutes for questions, and I've actually left 6 minutes for questions. So if folks have questions, why don't they put them in the chat? And Akash, I will pause here. Do you have any questions that you got on direct message?
Hi, Brian. So I haven't got any questions till now. I'm just scrolling through the chat, but no questions.
Well, how about this? Let me ask you. Oh, Larry Lee, thanks for the shout out. I appreciate it. Um, how about this? Let's put this in the chat. Has anybody used any prototyping methods like this when building out automation or building out any Salesforce solution in general? Put it in the chat. Many, sadly, no. Lucid chart. Miro is great. Andrew, if you don't mind, can you put a little bit of detail on how you used Miro? Sorry to put you on the spot, Andrew. One of the others, while we're waiting on that, some of the tools, Miro is a big one. Easy Retro is another one. It's not quite as popular as some of the tools we've talked about, Lucid Chart, but Easy Retro allows you to visualize. It's basically like putting Post-it notes on a board. So if you ever have done the sort of whiteboarding session or sort of live in-person design thinking session where you're putting Post-its on a board and writing down and posting them, Easy Retro does that really, really well. It's super simple, and it allows people on the session to create their own Post-its and put them up and move them around. It's very good and very simple. And Andrew said for prototyping logic for Service Console, I used Miro. Also a lot for non-Salesforce projects, Drupal, etc. Interesting. Thomas, Miro as well, mostly for high-level process definition. Draw.io, I actually haven't used that, so I'm going to check that out. It helps me see the possible mistakes before advancing in the flow, set more assignments to reduce my use of update records. Draw.io is good. Visily.ai. What I'll do, actually, so what I'm going to do, Akash, you're going to have the recording of this. What I will do as a follow-up to this, probably not today, but tomorrow, I'll take a list of all these tools that folks have listed out and I'll tweet them out in a tweet storm or something, because there's actually a lot that I've learned here and I appreciate Draw.io in particular. One thing I'd say to folks too, as kind of an action item on this, is it sounds like folks are using these tools to think and plan out their automations, which is great. But understand that now when you do that, that's an opportunity to circulate those to your stakeholders before you start building to get feedback, particularly in the areas that are high risk or complex or aren't totally clear. Like there's an opportunity there to get feedback in a quick, low risk way. So definitely think about that as kind of an action item coming out of this. Are there ways to bubble up those notes that you're creating for yourself, bubble them up to stakeholders as prototypes so you can get feedback? Oh, Andrew, great. Andrew, can you Andrew, find me on LinkedIn or find me on Twitter, and I would love to collaborate on the tools. Thank you. Akash, what do we have? 1 minute left?
Yep. So we have 1 minute left. I'll stop recording now.
Okay.